Well, good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you from the other side of the world, where it's a grey and rainy morning here at the Pacific coast of Wellington. Today, I'm going to speak with you about the topic of safety innovation, in particular the human-centered approach to it. And this is a material that I'm using and I'm working on pretty much every day. I'm heading up the innovation function here at WorkSafe New Zealand, and there we go. There are my slides. Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to start with a story. If you can take the next slide, please. This is a story about a very frustrated chief executive. I met him. He's working down in Christchurch on the South Island of New Zealand. And he was very frustrated with his workers because they were not filling in or submitting their risk assessments before they start work. So they had these called start cards. This was an electricity networking contracting business. So they're working on power lines and doing dangerous work. And these start cards are the usual risk assessment cards that I see in a lot of industries, and I just can assume that you have something similar where workers are normally asked to identify hazards and the controls and assess the risks so it's at an acceptable level before they start, and they normally sign on as a one-pager or maybe a two-pager that they have to do before they begin their task. Or if things change, they're supposed to do it as well. And this chief executive wasn't getting them. He wasn't receiving them at the rate with the quality that he wanted to have. So he came up with this idea that he was going to go out and visit the workers and sort of catch them in the act of not filling them out or not filling them out properly. So he went out earlier in the morning, a pre-start meeting, 6 o'clock, 6:30. What he found on this particular site surprised him. It was a team of 5 workers, and 4 of them had gathered around the bonnet of their truck, and they were using whiteboard markers drawing on the bonnet. They had drawn the road where they were parked, the power line next to it. They had made an illustration where the van was parked, and they were talking about how the work was going to happen. So we parked here, we've got traffic coming from here, so I think we're putting up the traffic signs about 200 meters away. That should be enough. What do you guys think? And then we use the following comms device to stay in touch with each other. You're up in the cherry picker. And then we're just going through everything that could happen. And someone added, yeah, I know one of our colleagues was in this area last week, and they said there was a crazy dog came running from over there. So they collectively or collaboratively added to this drawing. And the chief executive was stunned and delighted to find this was going on. And then he saw that the 5th team member was sitting 4 or 5 meters away, filling out the risk assessment, this piece of paper that he came there to sort of find fault with. And he was shocked to find this sort of disconnect between the paperwork and what people actually were doing. So he went over to the guy who was filling out the risk assessment and stop, just drop it. Please join your colleagues over here and be in on what they're doing. And when they were done with their collaborative drawing-based risk assessment, he addressed the team and he said, well, I came here today to tell you how important it is that you do risk assessments. You fill out this piece of paper and you send it to us in head office. But what I've discovered is that you have come up with your own practice that is actually, I think it's so much better than what we had. We have a responsibility under the law to assess and control the risks. And as far as I know, there's no requirement that it has to be done on paper. I think it's actually good enough what you're doing on the bonnet of the car. So please continue with that. Just write the date in the corner and put your names across it so I know who was involved in doing that. Just take a photo of that and send that to me. I'm going to fight for this becoming a new way of doing risk assessment in our business to see if we can make that work for us. So I think this is a really interesting experience in many ways. We can start with the traditional risk assessment, which I see it in so many industries and so many companies, and it tends to be more or less the same content, and it arrives at some sort of 5 by 5 risk matrix. Even though very few places have a specific legal requirements that it has to look that way, nevertheless, they often do. We do a lot of copy paste in the health and safety world. But I see it as really sad that we have just imposed these bureaucratic procedures onto workers that are not really interested in that way of thinking about their work. They're interested in doing a good work, in not having accidents, and we could be supporting them in coming up with practices that are more centered around what they need. In safety, we jump to solution, we put process over people, and we create processes that are effective to get a risk assessment done, but efficient to get it done, but not necessarily an effective way of assessing risk or understanding the thing. So today I want to talk to you about an approach to human-centered innovation that is sort of reintroducing the humanity, the human approach, the human lens to our health and safety practices. Next slide, please. So when you design something, it doesn't really matter what it is. It can be a tool, it can be a process, it can be a service. There's multiple criteria that we can use. You may be familiar with these three. They are, feasibility is about if the whole thing is doable. Do we have the money? Do we have the technology to do this? Can we actually do this? Viability is should we be doing this? Is it sort of, will this design flourish? Will it survive? Will it live in this ecosystem we're putting it into? And then we have this sort of human dimension to this. Do people want this? Do they need this tool? Do they need this procedure? Do they need this risk assessment? This piece of paper? Do they actually need a 25-page JCA to read before they go on? Do they desire it? Is it appealing to them? I think these are very good questions to ask, and I think they are questions that we have skimmed over. We jumped over them in the interest of creating some sort of liability management rather than something that is actually producing value for the workers who are the recipients of the trouble that we've created in our businesses. So today's approach, today's talk for me here is going to be about making sure that we sort of consider all three of this. It's not a question of forgetting about organizational concerns or priorities, but creating a more balanced approach where we have this sort of three-part Venn diagram where we take all these things into consideration. On the next slide, I want to explain a little bit more about this, that it's really about the relationship. It's not about completely changing the product or completely changing the people, but it's understanding the quality between people and the thing. If it's a process, if it's a product, if it's a form or an experience. On the next slide, please. We need to understand this relationship. What is it that brings delight to people? I think that in itself is a really interesting question to go out and ask your people about their experiences of your health and safety management system. What do they find delightful about it? What brings them joy? And see what they say. Likewise, what is it that brings people together? A bit like in the story I just shared. What is it that make people come together and talk about health and safety or the concerns they have about work, how they can manage avoiding things or achieving things? Bottom left here illustrate about what are the things that disappoint, that creates heartbreak. What on the bottom right here, what is it that frustrates people? I think that's a great question to just ask these basic human questions about what is it like to work in your organization? What is frustrating people? What is holding them back? What gets in their way of being professional or being successful or producing good quality outcomes? It's a great starting point. On the next slide, I'm gonna introduce this this approach. So today I'm going to talk about a process to do health and safety innovation. I'm going to talk about some methods, but I think it's really important to say something about the mindset, which is something about how we approach the work of innovation. And these are um, what do we have here? 7 characteristics that we have defined as our innovation team are really important to us. Um, Curiosity about not having the answers, but actually thinking that the answers are out there. A focus on people over process, that we really want to understand the lived experience of things, that, as I mentioned already. That we try things out instead of perfecting the design. It's okay to have an imperfect solution as long as we sort of keep learning from it and keep iterating. It's not supposed to be an approach in which we are preaching the solution, but we actually show how things are working. We want to be adaptable and flexible. We don't know what the solution is going to be when we start, and we have to be adaptive. We have to be okay with the ambiguity. Open-mindedness is very similar to the curiosity, but it's about seeking new perspectives, new ways of understanding the world. And it needs to be practical. You need to measure the benefit of these things. So the main point I want to make with this very brief introduction to the mindset is that I would say that these are 7 facets that are quite different to what I consider traditional health and safety role. Health and safety professionals are not really people that we think of when we think about curiosity, human-centeredness, iterative learning, show don't tell. It's much more of a sort of old power idea of locating a lot of power in one individual and then get to say what goes. And there's a place for that, I think. But if you're going to move into the health and safety innovation space, start growing these capacities in yourself. Ask you challenge yourself to be more curious, to be more interested in people's experience. So I think that anyone can become an innovator, and anyone more or less is an innovator. I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. But it's something, it's a mastery. It's a lifelong mastery journey, and we can only practice and set our mind to getting better at doing these things. On the next slide, I want to introduce you to the innovation process. If you have any training in innovation, you will be familiar with the double diamond. I'm familiar with 17 different innovation processes, but I really like this one because it has something simple, straightforward about it, intuitive to understand. You can see it's not really a linear process that you move from one end to the other, but it starts on the left with an opportunity. I'm going to talk a bit about what those can be, and then you move into a discovery phase, and then you can see how it's shaped as a diamond. It diverges in the first phase, and then it comes together again. That forms the first diamond. The second phase is the definition phase. So we're trying to define the target that we're innovating for. And then we arrive at some sort of understanding what we should be designing for. And the second diamond here is about designing the right thing. So we generate a lot of ideas, we pick 1 or 2 of them, and we start building prototypes, we test them out, and we gradually refine or iterate and build a solution that we can test in practice. So on the next slide, I want to start with the opportunities here. I've just grouped 4 different themes together here of what I call sources of itchiness. It's a very personal thing of mine that I often attend safety conferences such as this one, and I listen to people. And quite often I disagree, or I feel an itch coming on. I don't understand why they do it that way. And I have to remind myself to not be cynical about what people are saying, but actually see it as a potential source of innovation, that there's something there. I feel that it could be done better. On the left here, process inefficiencies. You will see a list of more or less traditional health and safety practices. Risk assessment, something I mentioned in my initial story. You all know about safety audits, I assume. They tend to be done a few times per year. They list a set of non-conformances or non-compliances. You don't have a traffic light system. Someone from out of town comes in and they are the arbiter of truth in saying what goes, what is acceptable, and so on. It takes a while. People respond to these events by either cleaning up or putting a few easy traceable hazards around so the auditor can find something and write it up so he's sort of happy. This whole gamification going on. Incident investigation are dreadfully slow, and the people they're supposed to learn, they don't really learn from that. You can take any of these practices and quite quickly engage with people to find out the points of delight, frustration, sadness, and what's bringing people together. And you realize that all of them, while we've invested heavily in making them valuable and produce something good for us, they're also to some degree ineffective, or there is latitude to imbue those practices with more value. The second cohort, or the middle theme here, is around unexpected success. And I find it quite an intriguing way to start thinking about innovation. When I've engaged with various businesses, I like to ask them, when do you have your best safety performance? Or where do you have your best safety performance? In a large organization, you will have quite a diversity in your performance levels. So you can ask to go to the sites where you have the best performance to try to figure out what is going on there. They're clearly onto something which is adding value. And for you to tap into that and start spreading those practices can be a great source of inspiration to work on what good looks like and learn from that. Similarly, when do you have your best performance? Is it on a Monday? Is it on a Friday? Is it before Christmas? Is it in when people are coming back or rested? Understanding these things can give you some clues on how you can start building new practices that support your people to perform well. I heard in the introduction here that you've been introduced to the concepts of human and organizational performance, safety two, safety differently. And you can use those theoretical perspectives as a source of insight to come up with new ways of doing things, to learn from normal work, to use more collaborative processes. Technological breakthroughs, in particular ICT, computer-based solutions, they're coming up every day. And sometimes it's inspiring to see a new technology, what it can do for us. And we can sometimes use that to our advantage. My team has just come up with a video-based version of risk assessments. Instead of filling out a big piece of paper, they created a module in which people just talking to their phone about the work they're going to do and how they're going to manage their risks. And it's recorded and it's going into central repository, and it's much more user-friendly. The big risk with technological solutions is that you sort of jump to the solution rather than thinking about what is it that people need. So I do want to caution you a little bit about that. Finally, the other one, we all experienced how COVID requirements immediately changed the landscape of what needs to be done, what can be done. And those are also moments of sources of inspiration where you can start innovating. So going back to if you go to the next slide, please. The process here, as I mentioned, it goes out, it diverges, and then it converges. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But each phase of this process has different methods. If you just do a Google search on innovation methods, you're likely to find hundreds, if not thousands, of different methods you can use. At the base of this slide, I've just listed a few of them. The discovery phase is really about asking and listening, observing, of opening up, and hence you have this sort of divergent shape. It's about surprising yourself, to step outside the world that you know. So we use techniques or methods for asking and listening, which is observations, interviews, conversations. But you might even use surveys, or you might do desktop research. The main thing is that you're trying to diverge. The question then becomes, well, for how long? I would argue that you need to do it until you start becoming confused, until you've gathered so much you can't make sense of it anymore. Then it's time to move into the definition phase, which is about making sense of the data that you have. It's not a linear process in the sense that once you've entered the definition phase that you can't go back. But whenever you have that moment of I need to make sense of this, then you can go into the definition phase and then come back to do more discovery if you discover that you need more data or more insight. The definition phase is about sort of zooming in on trying to define the problems from an end user point of view, or from different end users' point of view. On the next slide, I have one example of what this might look like. Oh, sorry, there's one more slide before that. I want to talk a bit about this divergent versus convergent. This is sort of what it looks like when we do divergent work, that you put up a lot of post-it notes on a wall, illustrated here on the sort of messy, organic look on the right of the screen. We just write things down, we put them up. We don't worry about grouping them, making sense, or categorizing them. When you move into the definition phase, or in that sort of focus moment of convergent phase, analytical thinking, or prioritizing, you group things, you prioritize things, you come up with this is more important than that, and so on. So that's sort of what that looks like on our walls. It's much more structured. So I can tell by just looking at a wall where the team is at in their thinking process. On the next slide, we have something about, so I'm going to talk a little about the discovery phase. The most important thing in the first phase is that you try to fall in love with the need of the people. I quite often need to work on my team to forget about their preconceived ideas or their biases that they have. I said, this is not the time and place. You can bring those into ideation, but your job right now is to be in the service of the people that work here. Understand their world, help them to express what it is that's holding them back, what is bringing good things to them. Find the worst, find the thing that is going on under the surface, and fall in love with it. It's the best way of putting it. It might sound a bit fuzzy and warm in a hardcore engineering business, but I think you get the gist of discovering something that is really cool that's going on. On the next slide, please. When we move into then the definition phase, we've collected lots of material. Imagine that you have 150 statements about experiences of work, and they're all organic, they're all in a mess. You need to sort of make sense of this, so you start grouping them together. You talk about what is happening in this sort of holistic sense of these experiences. You find themes, and then you try to define what is the problem that people are facing. On the next slide, I have an illustration of what this might look like. So I was doing some work with, it was a mining company over in Australia. And a group of mine workers had sort of worked on a part of the wall with all these problem statements. And they wrote down the problem statement as the mine has inadequate lighting. And there's nothing wrong. I could tell by the stories and the experiences that were up on the wall that it was a fair description. But it's not really a problem statement that gives many levers to pull. So I asked them to have another look at the wall and tell me in a new problem statement, who is having a problem? Where is the problem happening? When is the problem happening? How big is this problem? Give me some shapes and colors and outlines of this, so I actually have something that I can do with this problem. So they came up with the right-hand version, which was when driving at night in the east part of the mine, truck and grader drivers struggle to see rock signage and other vehicles due to dust, lighting conditions, and the layout of the mind. This negatively impacts communication, productivity, and safety. You can see how you've gone to a level of detail that you can almost smell a solution coming out of this, or a number of solutions. It's not a question of one being right, one being wrong, but different descriptions of the problem will allow you to engage with the problem in different ways. And unfortunately, we often end up in very vague problem statements. And as an innovator, as a facilitator of innovation, you have to help people get to an appropriate level that they actually can innovate against. So here on the right, we have a clear target that we can address. Moving into the next phase, which is ideation. On the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about ideation. So this is when we have defined a target and we need to generate ideas. And you've probably been in a brainstorming session where you're supposed to come up with ideas, and people may, be a bit creative in the first 3-4 minutes, and then it dies down and not much interesting comes after that. And the particular reasons for that, I don't want to go too much into brainstorming, but I want to bring you back to some basic values of ideation. The first one here is that when you're ideating, you are flaring, you are divergent, you're opening up. Anything goes. I want ideas to be wild. I want really bad ideas. I want people to relax. We occasionally run ideation exercises in which I'm asking for the stupidest idea that people can come up with to improve risk assessments, for example. And it just takes the edge of this sort of that we push ourselves so hard, and it's not good for our creative faculties if we're trying to sort of push out innovation or new ideas. So be relaxed, have fun with this stuff. Be collaborative. It's not about winning. It's about drawing on different sources. If we do this in a brainstorming session, I ask people to not criticize each other ideas. They say yes and, not no but. So yes and is adding to people's ideas. I just want quantity. In an hour, if I have 4 or 5 people, I want them to come up with 100 ideas. And to do that, you just need to go a bit crazy. If you think that giving people popcorn is a good idea to do incident investigation, well, if you think it's an idea, put it up there. Just get it out of your brain. It doesn't matter if it's good or bad. It's something that is in your brain at the moment. Write it down, let it go, and move on to something else. Maybe we'll combine in an unexpected way. So this is not about evaluating ideas. It comes later. Just keep on going with these things. Just be hinting about the ideas. Don't have detailed explanation what they are. And as I mentioned, this is about adding, not pushing back on ideas. So you can use lots of different techniques. We do use brainstorm, collaborative brainstorm. We also use crowdsourcing. We have a platform in our business where we send out a question to all employees to ask them, help us come up with ideas. What can we do to improve this situation? Here's a clear target, and sometimes it really generates unexpected ideas from frontline workers when you invite them into the ideation mix. All right, so in the interest of covering off the whole process, I want to move on to the next slide, which is talking a little bit about this thing of building practice, building new practices. When I was a consultant a few years ago, I occasionally had businesses calling me up and say, hey, can you design a safety 2 culture program? And I would stop them and say, well, no. Well, maybe I can, but let's talk a bit about the problem that you're trying to solve. Hold them in the problem space and work your way towards this. But even then, I didn't want to design something big and then just sell it to them. This is a question of trying. When you build new things, you want to try them small. You want to iterate, you want to learn it, you want to create a low-risk environment for innovation to be iterated and rebuilt and refined, retuned to fit your business. In health and safety, we often look to the neighboring organization, or we look to another industry. What are they doing in aviation or oil and gas? Because they have such good health and safety records, so we should do the same thing as them. And then we buy an off-the-shelf product and we implement it. We roll it out across the business and expecting people to just embrace it. I'm arguing here, when you do innovation, I think it's a better model in general for any business, is to start small. Start with a low fidelity version. Build something out of cardboard, or just do a bunch of drawings, use pipe cleaners. I don't really care what you use. Just give people something to give you feedback on, right? Build it in a cheapest possible way. Give the innovation team $50 to develop a solution and see what they come up with, and they're gonna make use of that. And you then invite people into the setting, and it's a bit artificial, I give you that, but it's a cheaper, low-risk environment to try something new. If it's a new way of doing online inductions, well, then you just have some drawings on a piece of paper and see what people like, what they click on, what they don't. And as you gain confidence, or as you lose confidence in certain aspects, you move on to developing a more high-fidelity prototype. And as you have that prototype, and you sort of you build to improve rather than to just learn, is where you start. Then you simulate it, that you invite more people in, and eventually you can run a bigger pilot to see what happens, and based on the results of that, you can then expand into business as usual all across your business. And I think this is a critical thing. In health and safety, we are often arguing that we should have a step change in performance. And I get that. We all want to be that heroic problem solver that comes in with a thing that solves everything. But here I'm arguing for something as bizarre as start small. Don't do the step change. Just look at the change that you can create. It's easier, it's less expensive, it's less risky to do this model. And it's easier to get permission to try something small than asking for the big money to implement a new program. On the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about something which I see happening a lot, that we get very married to the ideas that we come up with, the solution that we buy into. And then we don't listen for feedback because we don't want to be wrong in those situations. And it's perfectly understandable, but your role is not to be right. Your role is to come up with solutions that actually generate value for workers, for the business, so that you have good outcomes. Right? So you actually want to be wrong, or you want to invite feedback to prove you're wrong, at least. Build like you're right, absolutely. But then take a step back and test it like you're wrong. Ask people to tell you what they don't like about it, what's wrong with this solution, what they would do with it, what you can tell the designer about the solution. I think it's a really important step. All right, we're approaching the end of this. On the next slide, I do want to bring some reality into this. What I've given you so far is a innovation as imagined version of innovation. It looks fairly linear, it looks fairly doable. What, in my experience, this looks like in reality, what innovation has done is, it is messy. It is iterative. It goes back and forth. Imagine that you're, going to do an innovation project on, let's take incident investigation. Okay, this sounds good. I sort of know what the problems are with the old one, but then what? Where do you start? Who do you go and speak with first? Right? And what if they say, well, you should be speaking to someone else? And then you just end up meandering through the system to talk to various people. How do you know that you've spoken with enough people? These are really tricky questions that there is no checklist. how to say, you sort of have to build your own experience. After a while, when you've asked a lot of people, you will find that you've sort of saturated your knowledge about these things. You're not learning anything new, and it's sort of time to move on. But I'm trying to paint a picture that you don't really know where the edges of this process is. So you sort of have to start walking to the edge, and only to allow yourself to be confused, to come back, to move between discovery and definition, and then back to discovery and move forward again. And you need people, it's not for everyone to, well, everyone struggles with this process. Even I do so after having worked on this for a few years. It is kind of confusing to be in this space, but it's also hugely rewarding because you come up with some really interesting insights and some interesting ideas that can be helpful for a lot of people. As I'm thinking about this, I'm sure you guys have heard imagine a work is done. That there's a difference between the procedures that we put out there and how work actually happens. And the same thing goes for innovation. The process, the methods, they look super linear and simple, and just do them and you'll arrive safely at the other end. But we're dealing with ambiguity, dealing with uncertainty, and we just have to sort of bumble through it. And I think it has taught me some humility in understanding that that is actually how normal work happens. We often don't really know where the edges of safe or unsafe, where they are. They look good and easy to grasp on paper, but in reality, it's ambiguous interpretation required to know how far you can push things. All right, so I want to finish on a slide before I invite your questions in here. As a sort of summary slide. A lot of organizations, in particular when it comes to health and safety, but it's not unique to health and safety, they look to the future through a lens of fear. They are not particularly confident. Rather than sort of setting out or embracing this open-ended future opportunity in which a lot of different futures are available to us, they create a reactive focus, or they bring a reactive focus to the center of the table. They become focused on problem solving, of fixing things. They narrow information process. They constrain and conserve resources. They try to impose greater control. They reduce trust or remove human decision-making, judgment, and all those things that you need to have in a healthy organization. They end up doing a lot of writing procedures, and from that comes a lot of blame. It's all about predictability and control. And the really sad thing is that the future they're building that is emerging out of this lens is simply, at best, a problem-free version of the past. And this reactive lens brings so many problems. It creates disempowering cultures in which people don't try to do anything new. They escalate every small decision up the food chain, and they feel like they have no control over their own workplace. There's no pride, there's no joy in when you push this really far. And I assume that some of you have seen at least some aspects of that reactive, disempowering way of running a business. What I've been arguing here today is that we have an opportunity to insert at least a portion of a more creative focus. I'm not going to be so bold to say that you should have 100% of this, but you could try. I think it's possible. But that is, the creative focus is to look at the future with some sort of joy and appetite, that it's an open-ended thing, that you can create something that is unique and tailored, and it's bespoke to the needs of your business, and you can become what you need to become as a business. That changes the question to just fixing problems to what do we need to grow, or what can we grow? What is possible now for us as a business? It will invite you to look a little bit deeper to invite you to do double loop learning, which is not just error fixing and a simple feedback loop, but to look a little bit deeper. What are the assumptions that are driving us as an organization? It will invite you to get more perspectives, more diversity at the decision-making table, to ask more people to help you to broaden information processing. When you do this, it creates new energy very fast. It's quite a different way of engaging. When you invite people to say, hey, we want to create something, you should see how people light up. If you've done this, I'm sure you've experienced that. It's quite a nice way of gathering people. It might be a little bit like Pandora's box because people bring a lot of ideas and you need to be able to manage that, those expectations as well. And it builds connections between people rather than separates them. It's about distributing control to the levels where it needs to be distributed. We talk about pushing authority to where information sits, or where it's needed, rather than pushing all information to authority at all times. The bottom line is that a more creative focus, a more positive future focus for health and safety opens up the future to be created based on possibilities, based on strengths and aspirations. And as such, I think it's a very welcome addition to the toolkit that we already have. A quite solid toolkit on the reactive tools in any organization. But I'm hoping that I've created an appetizer here today for you to think about bringing in some new tools, method, approaches to think about some low-hanging fruit in your own business. All right, that's what I had planned for this presentation. I'm going to try to see if we have any questions. Right. Now, how would you recommend to apply this method to deploy disciplinary procedure, consequence managers, and non-negotiable life-saving rules in a large company? Right. So I'm trying to be true to the process. I have seen some innovative attempts in this space, but the first thing to do around this is to do a discovery process and talk to people that have been involved or been near a disciplinary process to see what their experiences are of that. What has been considered, what is important in that process? Is it the fairness? Is it the predictability? Is it the ultimately the consequences? Is it what it does to the person? Is it how it protects the business? What is it that makes people tick? Understand the desirability, because it's a really complicated issue around who gets to draw the line of what is acceptable and not in a business, and who gets to say where that line is. And quite often we draw that line quite harshly after the fact, and it's often based on the severity of the consequences rather than the act in it. All these are really tricky questions. So go out and talk to all your stakeholders about their experiences of this. And I'm not saying it's just about workers or just about managers, but create a map of the stakeholders that you have and understand their experiences and try to make sense of that, what it is that makes people tick, and not just about drawing the line, but also what happens after. If you're familiar with the restorative culture versus retributive culture around this, you know that it's not just a question of administrating a punishment or disciplinary action, but also a question of, well, you can frame it as a question of what needs to happen now to restore trust. If trust has been broken, how do you heal that? Which is quite a different, I guess, innovative approach to the whole thing. So based on that, you would have to, zoom in what the problems are you're trying to solve and design something from the ground up that can cater for all those needs that you have, identify a bigger portion of that. So that way you can come up with a different process than the often very process-based version of this that I see in organizations about acceptability and looking at intent. And I think it's a lot more complicated questions behind disciplinary actions than we have realized. So doing this from ground up discovery process is a great way to start. That's right. Happy to be called Clive too. It's a beautiful name. All right. If you want to know more about innovation, I suggest you just do a little bit of Googling. There's a wealth of resources around. If you want to know more about this process called Double Diamond, you Google that. If you want to know the methods, just Google innovation methods and it'll come up. If you get desperate, look me up and I'll be happy to engage and try to help you out if I can.